Welcome to Interviews of Grief, the show where we explore the depths of human emotion. I'm your host, Megan Pruitt. Grief is a universal experience that often hides in the shadows of our lives, rarely discussed openly. But it's through these heartfelt conversations that we find healing and hope. This is where we bring to light the story of those who have faced loss and the myriad of emotions that come with it. We're here to discuss the good, the bad, and the sometimes ugly aspects of grief as we seek to honor the memories of those we've lost and extend a helping hand to others navigating the same path. So join us as we embark on this profound journey, turning sorrow into strength, one conversation at a time. Hello and welcome to Interviews of Grief. I'm your host, Megan Pruitt. I want to thank you so much for joining me, sharing your stories, listening, providing feedback. It's meant the world to me and to so many others that are out there. We are 8 episodes in, which is hard to believe. And it has just been this really great experience and more than I ever could have imagined that it would be. In this episode, I want to do something a little bit differently where I go in and talk and give a little recap of each episode and also what I have learned. So in my experience and from the feedback that I have been getting, it's really like people have been saying, wow, I listened to this episode and then this episode and I didn't even realize, and this has been so great and I connected so much with this person. Thank you for doing this. And what's been incredible is that this feedback has been coming from people that I would have never expected, many times just acquaintances that I didn't even know had lost somebody, or, total strangers or people in my family that have reached out. It's just really been incredible. And there has not been a single episode where I want to say like something hasn't gone wasted. I have learned from every single episode. It has been, become part of my story, part of my journey. And it's just like this reflective mirror, really, where I'm like, oh, I remember when I was going through that, or, okay, somebody else was going through that as well. Or, just to have that perspective. And the perspective comes with sharing the stories. And so I want to let all of you know, if you want to reach out, you can go to Interviews of Grief. There's a form there. You can email me. If you know me, text me. I would love to hear your stories. There has been so many instances of people that are like, that I've interviewed that are said like, I've never talked about this. This is the first time I've ever talked about it. And then at the end, usually I'll get a text or some sort of comment where they're like, that felt good. Like I've never told her story or his story. I've never gone through it like this with anybody. And let's heal each other's hearts. I would love for you to tell me your story, or even hear your feedback. It means, I know I've said this, but it means really so much to me. And just thank you to any of you that have reached out or entrusted me to tell your story. It's not something that I take lightly, and it's my honor to give it a platform, to give it a voice, to try and get it out to as many people as possible. So let's just get right into it. Every episode, I ask somebody to give either a phrase or 3 words to decide their current, or to describe their current state of grief. And the reason why I did this is because grief to me is one of the most fluid experiences ever. One day you're like, fine, you're going along, and then like you hear a song or you drive by somewhere or something just hits you, something your kid says to you, and you're right back in it. Or, in the early days, everything seems like it's a trigger. And then you begin to heal and you do work and you hopefully, hear other people's experiences and you get a different shift in perspective. And so it's very important for me to get a gauge of where people are in their current state of grief. And that's where you kind of hear these different words or phrases to describe each person that I'm interviewing's current state of grief. And so Marilyn was my first interview. And Marilyn lost her son to the opioid crisis and her mother to dementia, or Alzheimer's. And what I loved about having Marilyn as my first guest was, For all intensive purposes on paper, Marilyn and I could not be any different. Or we couldn't, be more different. And it was pretty quickly, I had joined a local grief group here in town where I realized that grief is the most universal experience that we're all going to have. And that no matter your race, socioeconomic status, no matter the way that you lost your loved one, or any of the details surrounding it, it is a common shared experience, and we can't hide from it. It's going to happen to all of us. It's all of our fates. Some people are lucky enough to go along their life and not lose somebody in a traumatic way, but everyone you love, something's going to happen to them. And so Marilyn hit that home for me. And she is one of those people that would have never become an acquaintance or a part of my story or occupied a piece of my heart. And Marilyn is just so special to me. And it was my honor to have her as my first guest. Marilyn gave me two phrases for her current state of grief. It was growing through the grief and questions for God. This was something that was super reflective for so many of us. The questions for God, if you are religious and you are a Christian, why did God do this? Why did God let my loved ones suffer? Why am I alone? Questioning our own mortality, things like that. It's so, so common. And this episode is so poignant and worth such a listen just to hear how Marilyn navigated that. And if you are a Christian, I invite you to join, any of your local grief share groups through a church. It will help you go through this and realize just how normal it is and how it is okay to have these questions for God and that He has an answer. In this episode, I was just learning how to record. So the auto quality is terrible. I wish I could go back through and fix it, but it's something that I learned and tried to adapt, and we've come a long way. So there are points of the episode where you're going to need to turn it up or turn it down. I apologize on that one. Really, Marilyn takes a very, very brave look, if anyone's lost anybody to addiction, about kind of the dark side of addiction. I'll give you an example. She recounts having to hide her electronics when she knew her son would come over. She'd go put him in her trunk because his addiction was desperate to go and steal these things to pay for more drugs. He wasn't trying to hurt his mom. This was the addiction. And I think so many people who have lost a loved one or even are in the thick of addiction of one that they love can connect with. There's no bounds to it. And she talks about that, and she is so brave. And I just think that it's an incredible thing to listen to. And my heart really goes out to anybody who has had that kind of a shared experience. One of the things that was like that reflective mirror that I was talking about is how Marilyn feels like the system failed her and failed her son, whether it was in terms of getting help, it was in terms of the police doing their due diligence, that he was not just another number, but maybe something can be learned from his death. She felt like there was some failures, and so many people that lost their loved one to COVID or in other ways, I'm sure at some point thinks, oh, the system could be better. There were failures along the way, and that's just hindsight. And once you can kind of reconcile those things, it becomes more at peace with your soul, but you feel like you can still do something to fix it. And that's where Marilyn is at in her journey. And it's an incredible thing to listen to. It was also interesting, which I think so many people can connect with, was the anticipatory grief of her experience with her mother. She said in the episode that it was so hard losing her son, but her mother was such a part of her every day to day. It was her partner. It was, it's just, she was in the trenches with her mom. And that slow process of the grief of kind of seeing her mother wilt away is something that's so difficult, and so many people can connect with it. I had 30 days of anticipatory grief. Someone else in the next episode had none because they didn't see the death coming. But anticipatory grief is an interesting thing to explore and super common. And Marilyn talks about that in her episode as well. One of the things that I also connected with Marilyn is that she talked about the hard things that she was struggling with. And one of those that stuck out in my mind was her son passed away in a motel of drug overdose of deadly gray, which she describes, and it's incredible because I didn't even know it was really out there. Deadly gray could kill an elephant in its tracks. It goes and just stops the heart. It's like this insane cocktail of like 4 different drugs that just go, and it's a life ender. And so Marilyn talks about how it was so hard for her to drive by the motel where she lost her son. She still doesn't like to do it. And I remember having this moment, and a lot of people will talk about what that trigger is for them. So this was just like a small one, but for me, it was, I didn't like at first going into TJ Maxx. That's where I got to talk to my mom for the last time in her life. It was like in the aisles of TJ Maxx with a bunch of strangers. And it will forever hold that. But I was avoiding it at first. I was like, I don't want to go in there, like, because I can see it, I can feel it, I know where I was, I know who, I can see the faces of the people that were looking at me, having this like insane heart to heart, because I knew it would be the last time I spoke to her. I can remember just people being like, what is this woman doing? So it wasn't a pleasant memory, but I knew that I was starting to give it more life than it deserved. And what I mean by that is TJ Maxx is not a reflection of my mother. It does not define her life. It is not something that I should allow to occupy space in my life. It doesn't have to become this demon. And reluctantly, I was like, you got to go in there. You can't do this anymore. And this was only like a week or two after she died, maybe a month. And I was like, I've got to do it. You go take a deep breath and you go do it. And it's not necessarily fun, but you do it. And everyone has to do that on their own timeline. There is no right way to do it. There is no wrong way. I just knew for me, it was like one of those things that I didn't want to give more life than it needed. And so I really reflected with Marilyn that she doesn't like to go drive by that motel. She's not ready. And I totally respected that. And I bet so many of you can connect with that as well. I can't recommend Marilyn's episode enough, minus the audio issues. You'll turn it up, you'll turn it down. I wish it was better quality again, but it is such a good eye-opening episode for anybody who's lost somebody to addiction. Even if you haven't, I think anybody who's a parent needs to know, what kind of drugs are floating around there. The drug that her son took can even be in a gummy form, and kids wouldn't even know what they're taking. If you have lost a mother or a father and you've been a caretaker, there are so many incredible, insightful moments in this episode. It is absolutely worth taking a listen. And thank you, Marilyn, for forever being my first guest. And part of my journey. You occupy a part of my heart, and I'm so thankful for you. Our next episode was Josh Bolin. He is somebody that I know from town. His father committed suicide, and his 3 words to describe his current state of grief, which I very much connected with now, 2 years later, was peace, acceptance, peace, and grateful. And I can't thank Josh enough for doing this, because I feel that grief in the male culture is one of the most underserved communities. I don't think men are, and this will be a stereotype, and there are obviously, like Josh, exceptions to the rule, but there are not enough men that are talking about their grief, that are delaying it, that are suppressing it, that act like everything's okay. And I think that's very culturally reflective of like my generation. Like my parents would have never, talked about this. Mental illness wasn't something that was so out and open into the forefront. And I just think that Josh's episode, I know because people have reached out, men have reached out, women have reached out and told me that, this has changed things for them. And just him telling his story, getting on the podcast and just recounting some of the most difficult details of his entire life, how that can heal others. And it was also cool to do some follow up with Josh to, hear his process of just like getting out his story and like what that meant to him. That was really cool too. So, um, Josh, I think it's a perfect example if you don't know what people are going through. For all intensive purposes, he's like this successful businessman in town. He is kind of, going through it and, has a beautiful family, all of these things. And it's really just kind of like a testament to him that you can carry these burdens and they're not outwardly seen or known, but he did an incredible thing to go ahead and share all of this with us. Another thing about Josh's episode and his story is that out of everyone that I've interviewed so far, he experienced grief at the youngest age. So Josh was in college when he lost his dad. And there are so many points in the podcast where he talks about how he grew up in an instant, how like one phone call changed everything. He went from this happy, outgoing life of the party, not a care in the world college boy about to get engaged, to he got this phone call from his mother and everything changed for him. And I this just stuck with me. And I was thinking like, and I even said it in the episode. I said, I got to have my college years, so I don't know what that's like, but I can reflect now with small young children, how much this everything has changed and how I'm a different person. And I was very thankful after listening to his episode that, I got to have my college years uninterrupted. And then I started, it's that shift in perspective that everything, the littlest things can give you, where I'm like, you know what, God, I might have been lucky to lose my mom in my mid 30s. And just you kind of recount in your mind, like you cannot take anything for granted. And Josh is just so honest about what the grief looked like going through at such a young age and how profoundly it changed him. And so in Josh's story, he's about to kind of graduate college. He's engaged to be married. He quickly has children. And it's like he had to do that while going through this grief. And part of what he recounts is that there are periods of time that he does not even remember. And I didn't have the same experience, but I could so see why. And I bet a lot of people could connect with this. I think that there is absolutely a mental chemical component. And, you hear of this like in stories of war where people just like block it out. And that's just a function to keep the train moving. And we've all had some sort of PTSD, triggers, dreams, memories, behaviors, just the craziest things. So one of the things that Josh recounts is that to this day, every time he gets a phone call from his mom, because his mom was the one that called him and it wasn't a typical day or a time that she would call, she was calling to let him know that, his dad had passed away. Every time she calls and he sees that name on the caller ID, it's like this little twinge of like a reopened wound. And he still thinks about it. All this time has passed, but he still thinks about it. And I know what it's like. The phone was the delivery of all of my worst nightmares. Like I am so thankful now that I put my phone on do not disturb at night so I don't have to like worry if a scary phone call is going to like come through. And it's just something that I've kind of retrained my brain to say like, you may get bad news one day or, you never know what's around the corner, but it's okay. You don't have to associate the phone with like these really hard triggers and everything like that. And I just think that Josh so bravely recounts all these kind of like hard components of grief and gets into the nitty gritty that a lot of people don't. And I really appreciated in his episode. And I think one of the most impactful moments is how he talks about a reoccurring dream. that I think so many of us have, or this like image, this hard part of the image of death, or something that we've gone through. And he talks about this dream that he keeps having where he can see his dad, and his dad pulls up a gun to his head, and Josh is there, but he's just out of reach to do something about it. And, like I have my version of this. I think everybody does with anything that is a trauma induced event in their life. And you can't really control when it comes or how it comes. I'm so thankful mine's not frequent, but it's definitely, jolted me out of bed a few times. But again, it's like this chemical component that, your brain is hardwired. You're recounting something that was difficult. It could even be a coping mechanism that's pretty dang torturous. But Josh really bravely talks about that. And it is just such an incredible episode. Something else that I wanted to touch on is that he talks about the reference of time during grief, how he felt like everything during those immediate moments, or when he comes home and a bunch of his childhood friends are there, um and how he like felt like everything was moving at 1,000 miles per hour, but really, time was moving slow, or vice versa, whatever your experience with this is. And I have those same reflective moments with my mom, where it's like whether I'm arriving at the hospital, or like I can feel my steps going into the funeral home where I know I'm going to see her, dead body for the first time, or whatever it is, or that hour that she fought after we pulled her off the ventilator. It seemed like, you know, 5 years, but it was only an hour. Or in some of those same exact moments, it seems like it went by so quick, and I can't even remember everything. But there's this reference to time that I think a lot of people will connect with. And again, he's just a brave dude for doing this. One of the things that was an opposite reflection for me is how Josh recounts that this experience that he had with his dad hardened him. So before, he was like life of the party college boy, not a care in the world, newly engaged. And then he said, like, with one phone call, with one moment, his entire life changed, and he lost his young adult life. And I don't feel like I lost my young adult life, but I'm a different mother, I'm a different wife, I'm a different person, I'm a different businesswoman. And it changes you. And I think he was so brave to talk about this. So anybody can benefit from this episode. Again, Josh, like, thank you. Words will never do or express how thankful I am for you to have shared that story and that pain. And I have gotten so many messages. I've tried to send you screenshots of most of them, of people that have listened to your episode, the comments that have come out with it, the private text messages, the private Facebook messages that have come from your episode. You sharing your story has changed so much. We're planning on doing a second episode with Josh, because I feel, and he feels it too, like we just skimmed the surface. And there's just a lot more to be said about all of this. One of my hopes for the future is that we can get like a group of like 2 or 3 guys together, and do an episode of like shared experiences of men, or shared experiences of suicide. And I look forward to kind of like growing the podcast and seeing where it will go. But Josh, again, thank you so much for your time and for trusting me to help tell that story. You were incredibly brave. The next episode would actually be my own. I very quickly realized that here I am sharing the stories of other people and referencing my own. And on this platform, I hadn't kind of recounted my own story. My 3 words for my current state of grief at that time were grateful, acceptance, and a renewed sense of faith. And those still are holding very, very true for me. And I wonder if the words change less as more time goes past your loss and your journey. That would be something interesting to kind of look at. So this was interesting for me to kind of get on and tell my own story. So I had been invited to do a podcast for people who had lost somebody to COVID early on, and it was like so fresh. I think my mom had maybe been gone maybe 3 months. Um, and I was a mess telling that story. It was the most vulnerable that I had ever been. It was with a woman named Jennifer. For Those We Lost was her podcast. And she would actually be my guest in the next episode. And I cried. I went through the story. It was like healing, like so many of my own guests said, like, I've never really gone through this top to bottom and like just said it all out loud. And what a difference experience it was months later. And after having done some like work, and have a better understanding of this and coming to so much more terms, just like telling my story at what a better place I was in, than when I had recorded the story first of losing her. And so I kind of like talked about everything, and I'm really grateful for being able to tell my own story because it was like I had come out the other side almost. And I got to share all of the details. And there's a lot of reflections in my episode of like the perspective of it all and like what had helped me, what I struggled with. But episode 3 is my story. And I just, I've gotten some comments back from other people who've lost somebody to COVID. And I'm just so grateful that my story can help somebody else. So, in the episode 4, I talk about Jennifer. And Jennifer is, again, the woman that had interviewed me on her podcast. And, again, just somebody that I would have never crossed paths with that is now a shared part of my story. Her words were healing, community, and letting go, which so many of us that are going through grief have things that we need to let go of. And Jennifer lost her mom fairly early in the pandemic. Her mom was at like a memory care facility. She had become her primary caregiver, and her episode recounts this beautiful journey of like mother and daughter in different phases of life, and that she had written the story of anticipatory grief of how her mom was going to die, and it was going to be to dementia or memory loss, and that was it. And, this crazy thing of COVID comes along and rewrites the story for her, which it does for so many of us. And I talked about this too. I had always just naively assumed that I was going to lose my parents like I lost my grandparents, which is old, in their bed, surrounded by family, like just this beautiful, beautiful experience. And that is, I was beyond lucky just to get to lose 2 people that I loved like that, but that was not the story, and that's not realistic. And so she talks a lot about that in her interview of like, I had a plan. I thought I knew how this was gonna go. Again, that common theme of perspective. She lost her mom early in the pandemic when we didn't know if COVID was on surfaces, if COVID continued to live in deceased individuals. She recounts one of the, I would say, like top 5 moments of just heartache where, oh, she wasn't able to be with her mom. And so, like all the COVID protocol, was not allowed to see her, be with her. Her mother died alone. And she calls the funeral home. She's thinking, I'm going to get to see my mom now. And she's so close for the first time geographically to see her mom. And they said, I'm sorry, you can't. Your mom is wrapped up in plastic wrap because they didn't know if COVID could be spread. And it was against every rule. And then I started thinking about the people that didn't get funerals or memorial services, or, people whose loved ones' bodies were like put into a refrigerated truck because they were losing so many people and the morgues were overwhelmed. There are so many components of this that is unreal that your average person doesn't think about, or even a person who also lost their mother to COVID never even thought like, wow, this is how it could have gone down. And Jennifer talks a lot too about like giving grace to yourself when caring for a loved one, why it's necessary to let go, the injustices of COVID. Her and I touch on how frustrating it is that when we say the word COVID, a lot of times things are censored or suppressed. We talk about that, about like being silenced still to this day, which is kind of frustrating. But Jennifer's story is incredible. She was the inspiration of starting a platform for me. She is writing a book. And when it goes live and can sell, I will absolutely have links to it. She has an incredible story, and it is so worth listening to. Episode 5 is with my friend, business partner, Brandon. This was an incredible episode, and it was also really unique for me because I got to, he's written a book called Just Do. And I got to read the book and then pull from points of the book as reference. So I felt like I knew his story and then actually get to talk about it, which is, it was so cool. So Brandon's 3 words were balance. He actually had 4. Balance, freedom, be okay, and grace. And this was a powerful one. So Brandon lost his wife. They had 3 young children, and they lost her to breast cancer that eventually spread everywhere. And this interview is so unique in the fact that I guess they saw it coming, and his wife Rachel was so incredibly strong in her faith. And what that can do to grief for those around you, for her, for everyone, that book and their experience is such a testament to Rachel's faith during the entire process. Now, this interview also tackles for Brandon what grief looks like as a widow, as a single parent to 3 children, that he is very transparent of like, I was not the one that did X, Y, and Z, and now I'm doing it, and I'm trying to do it the best that I know how. And it's an incredibly raw and honest look at those moments. And I would also recommend, in addition to listening to this episode, to following him on social media. It's just, there's strength in how he shares his story. There's no doubt about it. We also touch on dating after loss, which is something that is tricky to navigate. And he does so bravely and honestly. I think the largest thing, and I really expressed this to Brandon in my interview, was that there's a moment in his book, and that we talked about after, where he is talking with his pastor. He knows that it's the end. There was an incredible amount of suffering, and she fought so hard. And the pastor took him aside and said, I want you to know it's okay to have the emotion to be relieved. It's like this permission. You can be relieved. It's okay. And I'm reading this and I'm like, I didn't even know that I needed permission. I remember so vividly feeling the relief that the suffering had ended, that this journey was going to be over, that she was going to be in a better place. I had always operated, and I think she did too, knowing that she would not make it out the other side of this. And that COVID was just this silent fast. Once it struck, that's what so many of us recount, like, God, it happened so fast. By like day 4, if it was going after your lungs, like your lungs were trashed. And it happened so fast. And it was like when she took that last breath, it was relief. And then I can remember being at somebody's house after it had happened. And one of my friends was like, I was like, worried, I'm glad you're doing okay. Like, I'm glad. And I was like, it was harder to watch her suffer than to lose her, because now I know she's with God. And it was this permission. And I never knew what I was looking for, what I was feeling, until I read his book. And so if any of you that are listening to this recap need permission to feel like you were a little bit relieved, and don't ever mistake being relieved for like an absence of sadness or an absence of like just absolute devastation. That's not what I'm saying, but it is okay to be relieved. And Brandon needed it, I needed it, and I feel like a lot of other people out there who watched a loved one suffer or incur a slow death, you know, it's okay. You might need that relief, and Brandon is that gift um, of the relief that I didn't know I needed. Again, his book is called Just Do. It is so incredible. His social media is sometimes it cracks me up, and it is so just like the raw moments. Like his daughter's like, "Dad, I think it's time to shave my legs." So he literally is in the tub shaving his legs with his daughter because, Rachel, his wife, is not there for these moments, but he's going to do it, and he's going to do it the best that he can. And he's going to get in there, and these moments are not going to stop. And it's just an incredible, like, kind of look at all of this. And it's a testament to faith through his wife, to his journey. And I think his words, too, just so reflect that balance, freedom, be okay, and to give yourself grace. I always say it's okay to not be okay. It's okay if you need to give yourself grace for the moments before the death and afterwards. We're only human, and there are pre-wired things into our absolute being that affect grief. Like I read this book on the chemical makeup of grief, and they did studies, and they looked at some like animal studies, and they knew that like gorillas or like orangutans, apes, I don't know, one of those monkeys, they know, with their baby, that their baby has perished, and they no longer care for it in the life sustaining ways. They won't try and feed it, they won't try and groom it. But there are connections in the brain where you just can't believe that it's happened. And the monkey still carries around the baby for several days until the brain can rewrite the history of events. And there was just times when I walked up to my mom's casket, and somebody who's very reserved, has control over their emotions for all intents and purposes, loses it. And I'm like, how is this real? How is this real? And your brain can't even comprehend some things. So give yourself grace in those moments. And that is something that Brandon touches on and talks about and is real. And I don't think that there's any more of a like realistic look into this lens behind the curtains that you can get. And so, I'm so thankful that Brandon's come into my life and to share his story and to read his book. And now to see he owns a publishing company, to see what they're doing with that on the other side of sharing other people's stories. It's incredible, like what's come from this and what he's done in honor of his wife's like legacy. So definitely go back, listen to episode 5 with Brandon. It's a good one. In episode 6, I had the absolute privilege of speaking to Jessica. She was, I guess, my first kind of like stranger or non-acquaintance that joined me on the podcast. And her phrase for grief, her 3 words, were grief is not linear. 4. That's all right. So Jessica's story was one of those ones, they all stay with me, but hers was just so, I guess, aligned with my story. And we had so much in common. We were the same age. We, both lost our moms to COVID, a lot of the same philosophies, just everything was like super similar. It was wild. And so, this was an episode. Jessica was working at a nursing home, and her mother was the activities director there, and her grandmother was a resident. And in a period of 6 days, she lost 3 people. It was her mom, her grandma, and an uncle. And not only that, but she had the experience of literally her nursing home that she worked at was wiped out, like resident after resident after resident. And she said in there, I had never seen a dead body until now. Like, that's just like something normal to say. Like, and so, due to some lax protocols, COVID made its way through her nursing home, including her grandmother and her mother. So, she there was so many like parallels, like medical decisions by the phone, amount of time, oxygen dropping to like 40. There was just all of these like reflective moments where I'm like, oh my God, yes, me too. Yes, me too. Yes, me too. And Jessica was really brave about being raw and giving this raw look at her grief and how she said she just like collapsed to the ground when she like learned that her mom was gone and everybody. And she says, like, how could I lose three people I love in 6 days? And there's just so much like honesty to her look at grief. And so, I'm sitting through this whole episode and I was like, good God, like, if I just had to deal with my mom, what if it was like my mom, my grandma or grandpa, or an uncle or an aunt or a cousin, and this story is so common in COVID loss, and it's something that I'm really trying to bring awareness to and shed light to, is that like generations of family were just taken by COVID, and in short time periods too, because the exposures were so close. And it is just wild to think of. And Jessica's story really recounts that lack of closure. So if any of you identify with that, this would definitely be an episode worth listening to. She didn't get to have a funeral. And so, something that we touch on in this episode is her mom assigned her medical power of attorney. And so she was in charge of her mother's care, her mother's decisions. And for so many of us, it's that point of when you decide to end care. Because, and I tell this to all people who didn't lose somebody by COVID, if it comes up in the conversation, is there was the intervention of a ventilator. And the ventilator allowed the lungs to function as if they didn't have COVID by artificial means. If we did not have the ventilator, in my opinion, people would have died in a week, because that's about how long it took for COVID to come and absolutely cripple and debilitate the lungs. But due to the ventilator, you could prolong all of that. And for some people, it allowed for healing, but for the majority, it did not. And then so many of us were faced with the decision of when to end care. And so we talk about her mother's medical wishes and medical power of attorney. And I think that this is so important. And so in an upcoming interview, I have scheduled for an attorney that specializes in will and probate and medical POAs and all of that to join me. And there are going to be so many lessons learned through some hard experiences. I'll just kind of like give you an example. It now states in my medical wishes that if two assigning physicians that are caring for me provide a metric of less than a 30% meaningful chance of recovery of life to end care. And that was important for me because it's as detailed as these medical POAs documents are, medical directives are, they are very subjective and room for interpretation and lack for enforcing. And it gets cloudy. The waters get cloudy or muddy, whatever you want to say. And so I want a benchmark for my loved ones where if two physicians say, you're looking at less than 30% chance of her recovery, of any sort of meaningful recovery. I want that to be the metric where things stop. And my mom didn't have that. We didn't even know to have the thought to have that. And a lot of people don't have that. And a lot of people also don't realize how many details can be added into a medical directive document. And so I think it's just so important Again, it's something that we're all going to face. This is something that I've literally heard in so many people's stories, and that Jessica touches on, like that weight of, she gets this call, her mom's having a hard time talking, she's hearing alarms go off, her O2 drops, and the lady's like, "Do I have consent to care for your mom?" And Jessica's like, "What are you talking about? Like, why don't you ask her?" And she finds out that she was appointed medical POA. It's wild. And it warrants a conversation, and there is a lot of insight. Something else that I want to touch on for Jessica's interview is how open she was to mental struggles. And this was something that was eye opening for me. And then that was reflected in the next episode that I conducted. And that I think it would be very interesting to take a look at people's journeys. So, the only parallel I can draw to Jessica's experience is like that she like went to war. It was, dead body after dead body at the nursing home, 3 consecutive losses, so much trauma. I don't know how you come out the other side of this in one piece. And that's just me being perfectly honest. And so, she had seen body bag after body bag, and she was struggling with this. And she's so brave about how she was struggling. And she talks about that she was on the street and she saw a trash bag, and it triggered that. And she had, I think she calls it a psychotic break, and had to go and get some help. And just the fact that she can say that out loud, that it's part of her story, that she went to get the help. There are so many people out there, no matter how you lost somebody, or even if you didn't lose somebody, if you've gone through something hard, whether it's like a car accident or, you're a military member, there are so many components of this that can break you. And she gives a really honest and raw look, and it kind of opened my eyes to like the collateral damage that this pandemic has done to people. And Jessica is your picture of somebody that came out the other side of this, that struggled, that is open and honest, that wants to share her story, and that understands. I mean, just the show title of her episode, Grief is Not Linear. This girl gets it. She's been through stuff. Um, and it's absolutely an episode worth listening to. Again, Jessica, thank you for sharing this. You were meant to reach out to me. You were meant to tell this story, to be part of my story and so many other people, and your perspective and your details that you were willing to give me in this episode. I mean, I think it was your shorts, because I take all the episodes and then I put them into shorter clips. This is to avoid, Facebook or Instagram, whoever, from censoring us, and then hopefully drive people to the episode. Those ones went viral with like thousands of views. I think you've changed a lot of lives, and just thanks for trusting me to tell your story. In episode 7, Mags Bossert joins me. And she was a really unique story. So her mom was a twin, and they were identical twins. They lived together, raised their children together. Um, she even recounts how, like, if they would say, like, if something happens to me, it's happening to you too. Like, they were going to die together, everything. Like, they were just so connected. And Mags lost her mom and her aunt to COVID. And her 3 words to describe her grief were physically feel, constant, and all encompassing. And Mags took a real hard look and was super descriptive about what it was like to have her entire world just turned upside down. In her episode, we talk about so many things that we had in common, like being a mother, what it was like trying to navigate grief as a mom when you are trying to just figure it all out yourself. And she takes like this really honest look of what it was like to really struggle in grief, and that her like kids were her reason for kind of like trying to make it through this, because she just missed the 2 most important people in her life. We talked extensively about the isolation that loved ones faced during their fight, and then what it was like on the other side of being the loved one, and what that isolation was like during COVID. Josh touched on it a little bit in his episode, but I feel like Mags goes into it the deepest. And she talks about having previously existing struggles that manifested during her loss, whether it was self harm or her eating disorder. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from Mag's episode that we should all consider is that she says, I wish people could get there. And she was referring to getting help before she did. And that she really struggled. And these previous issues that she had made its way on out during her grieving process, like it does for so many people. And this is just like the reoccurring theme of the damage that can be done, you know, to grief. And I'm not saying that Mags did this, but I've seen this in my grief group and just with people that I've known. If you delay and you suppress that grieving process, and we learn this, it's going to come out. It's going to manifest its way in other, manifest itself in other ways. And it's just so important to go and to do work or talk to somebody or at your own speed navigate this, because it is now part of who you are and it can't be avoided and it will manifest. And it was really interesting to kind of like hear these stories of people, of like why they joined grief group, or whether it's in the podcast of like, yeah, I wasn't going to deal with it, but it's still there. And so I think one of the most powerful moments of Mag's interview is like how she has made it out the other side and how she had regrets of like delaying when she sought help and the help that she's getting now, and just how like common this is for anybody who's like struggling or going through something. She was extremely brave in her episode. And again, it was like this reflective mirror for me because we both lost our moms. We were both moms ourselves trying to navigating kind of this whole, thing. But Mags was incredibly brave during her episode, and to lose a mother and an aunt, and she referenced it. It was so powerful in the episode. She was like, when I was a kid, I thought it was normal to have two moms. I didn't have a reference point to know that like my mom's identical twin was like a bonus mom, and then she remembers the moment when she realized like that she wasn't in a typical situation. So she lost two people so consecutively that were such a fiber woven into her life. And I can't imagine. I just can't imagine her episode, all of these episodes. There's so much to be learned. I feel like my review doesn't even really like do it justice or go into the details. I'm so thankful that I can go back and that I've interviewed each one of these people. There's so much that can be learned. Again, listen, follow. If you can give a review, if you're listening on Apple, give a star review. That will, get it seen more. Don't ever hesitate to reach out or to feel like your loss isn't the scale of some of my other guests. That's not what's important. It's just important to give this a voice, to share. The healing that takes place is incredible. Thank you to all of my 6 guests that have shared their story. I can't wait to do more of this. I can't wait to do it in different ways. Like I touched on a little bit with like the attorney for medical POA, wills, trust estates, things like that. There's so much to be learned there. I can't wait to get a group of people together who have experienced something similar to talk about it. I want to continue shedding light on things like the opioid crisis, mental illness, seeking help, what helps grief, what doesn't, bringing just a more understanding and awareness to what's normal during grief. It's all things that I'm really passionate about. And again, I can't thank you enough for listening and taking time to join me. Until next time.